I'm giving a lecture today on data science in the field, which is kind of a case study about how you use some data science techniques in industry. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself in a second, but if you want a copy of the slides, it might be too small to take a picture of, but there's a QR code up the corner there. But I can give you the link at the end if you want the slides or need them available in another format. I'm James Thomas, and I'm a data scientist. I work here now at the university, and I work in the Jean Golding Institute, that's physics, and that building there is Royal Fort House, and on the first floor, that's where the Jean Golding Institute is based. And we are the Institute for Data Science and Data-Intensive Research at the university. We do quite a lot of things. We're quite small, but we work with lots of people across lots of schools and faculties. And I kind of picked out a few things that you might be interested in doing. We've got a data ethics club, which we meet every couple of weeks, I think, and they discuss issues around ethics in AI and machine learning, so that might be of interest to people. We've got a data visualization interest group. Both of those are open to anyone. On our website, you can find out more about those. We run a Slack kind of networking site where you can kind of see job adverts, things like that. That might be of interest. And we also run some widening participation summer internships for undergraduates over the summer, working on some data science projects as well. So they go live at some point soon. So if you're interested in those, let me know. The aim of the talk today is to just give you, as I said, an example of how data science is used in industry. It's very much what I would call small data. So you've heard of like big data and kind of things that you would do machine learning on, things like that. This is kind of the exact opposite of that. So in this example, there isn't very much data, and it's very expensive to collect that data, and you'll see why in a second. So at every stage in the data pipeline, we're trying to make sure that the data we've collected is of use somehow, and if there's a problem, trying to pick that up as quickly as possible. So I've got data validation there kind of highlighted. That's a really important point. And then the other thing I'd like to pick out as well is the fact that in the job that I used to work in, you have to work a lot with non-specialists. By non-specialists, I mean non-scientists, but also people that don't really know about how to handle data. They don't know about maths. They don't know about computer programming or anything like that. So you have to kind of be quite clever about how you talk and liaise with those people as well. So I'll give you a kind of quick bit of context for why this project is of importance. Everyone knows about climate change, and there is a challenge to get to net zero at some point. People keep saying they will. So I've got a graph here of, on the y-axis, UK annual greenhouse gas emissions in million tons of CO2. And then on the x-axis is time. So to date, we've decreased our emissions quite a bit in the UK, according to this metric. And the challenge is, how do you get that to go all the way down to zero, kind of on potentially a steeper gradient than we've been going already. This is quite a big challenge because this kind of gap that we've gone down so far, we've done a lot of the easy wins. So one of the big ones in that list, we've switched from inefficient coal-fired power stations to much more efficient gas. We've got a problem now with supply of gas, but that has decreased our carbon emissions somewhat. We've done lots of other things as well, but the challenge is, okay, that's all the low-hanging fruit gone, so how do you continue that process? A couple of tweets there. They're a bit old now, but it's still going. There's this little Twitter account that you can follow, if Twitter's still going, that tells you every time coal is used in the UK grid to produce electricity, and you can see, oh, okay, that coal has been used again. And quite often, like most days, you see that the coal is used just to sort of top up. So in terms of how do we reduce it the rest of the way, they've kind of got, in these colours here, they've split up into supplying energy, like electricity to people, transport, business and residential use, and other kind of emissions of greenhouse gases that kind of contribute in the same way as CO2. So I'm going to pick out heat amongst those, which is kind of a mixture of the residential and non-residential. So if we kind of rearrange that graph and just look at end use in terms of what's using heat, what's not using heat. and what's using energy for transport, you see that heat, is kind of keeping us warm, is quite a major use of energy. And then if you further subdivide that, domestic heat, so keeping people warm in their homes, is quite a big use of energy. One of the big challenges with that, though, is that demand is very strongly time dependent. So another graph here of time along the x-axis, and on the y-axis you've got domestic energy consumption in a unit called terawatt hours, which is perhaps a little bit of an odd unit to measure things in. But I've got a little bit of a sort of a question to pose to you. Given that I've scaled it like that, it's kind of an indication of what the numbers might be. Does anyone know what the quarterly this is? So this is kind of a quarter of what a year would be, where electricity would maybe fall on this graph? Anyone hazard a guess? 60 terawatt hours or basis, just somewhere in the middle? Yes. Anyone else? Higher, lower? Higher, a bit higher? Well, I've kind of got a rule of thumb, which is obviously, I know the answer, so I back calculated it, but if you think of a kettle that you have in your house, that's about 3 kilowatts. Now, if you assume that every person, you can kind of, the equivalent energy that everyone uses is maybe running that kettle for like an hour a day. You know, it's not, we don't boil the kettle that much, but let's just say that. So that's 3 kilowatts for an hour a day is 3 kilowatt hours. That's what the unit is. So that's 3 kilowatt hours per day per person, and the actual number is about 4. So it's about right. This is a quarter, which is about 100 days. There's about 70 million people in the UK. That gets you about 20, which is kind of what it is. You see it goes up and down, so it goes up in the winter. What about gas? So you could do a similar calculation for gas. Okay, given the scale that I put here, you could probably guess that gas is higher than that. And if you think that maybe if you have a gas boiler in your house, maybe that runs, you know, for each person, you could say it maybe runs for, say, 30 minutes a day on full, which is like 10 minutes for a shower and then sort of other uses of energy. That gets us a number that's about 70, using that kind of rough rule of thumb. But the thing to notice is it's strongly time dependent, so it goes up and down a huge amount. So at its lowest in summer, it's about the same as electricity, but in winter it can kind of be like 4 times higher. So everyone talks about decarbonising electricity, but we've also got to think about how we heat people's homes. That might be with electricity, but we've got to increase the amount of electricity we then generate as well. And just to pick out, within that gas usage, there's also variation within the day, and there's variation electricity as well within the day quite strongly. So we could think about using renewable energy for all of that. There's another problem. Not only is the demand that we've just seen strongly time dependent, the source of energy is also very strongly time dependent if you get it from renewables. On that map on the left there, you've got some points in red and blue, which are, whenever the image was taken, onshore and offshore wind capacity that we use for generation. And a graph on the right-hand side, I've got wind in blue and actually overlaid solar generation as well. This was in 2019, so it's going to be a little bit higher now, solar, because we're installing quite a lot of solar all the time. This is just the month of January, so it's quite cold at this point, and the heat demand will be quite high. But, I mean, just kind of visually looking at the graph, you can see how intermittent the generation is from both solar and wind. So, again, a great problem is how do you store this energy that you use from renewables and then allow people to use it whenever they want, so kind of disconnecting the demand and the generation from each other. You might think do it with batteries or something like that, but the kind of, if you do the kind of the sums, you're like many orders of magnitude different in terms of the capacity of batteries and the sorts of energy demands that we're talking about in this on these scales here. So I will get to another context in a second. One thought, which may not be the answer, but at least it's something to investigate, is could you use somehow the existing gas network, which we have the ability to store gases, or from a technical point of view, you can store gas quite easily because you just need a container to put it in, potentially. Could you use renewables to generate hydrogen gas through electrolysis, because that's the greenest way to produce hydrogen gas, store that gas somewhere, whether that be in a physical metal tank or maybe it's kind of under the ground in a sort of disused aquifer or something like that, and then distribute it to local homes when it's needed, as and when. And we're kind of used to doing that, so we're used to laying kind of pipelines and things like that, so that this is a kind of established thing. And there is already, just like there's an electricity grid all over the UK, there is already a gas grid. That's the national transmission system for gas, and then obviously most homes have gas at the moment in the UK, and I keep saying gas, I mean North Sea natural gas, mainly in the UK at the moment. So what you might ask is it feasible even to replace natural gas with hydrogen in the UK? And there's so many questions to look at there in terms of, well, how do you produce it? Is it green, et cetera, et cetera? The project that I'm now talking about is actually answering a safety question. And it's asking, or it's answering part of the question of, is it the same level of risk using hydrogen as natural gas? Because we have accidents with natural gas at the moment. You hear in the news every now and again that very sadly you have explosions in people's homes and people die. Is it riskier, or is it actually much safer? And so you might want to look at how many leaks do you get? How big a leak is it if you have a gas leak? Given that you've got a leak, how much does gas accumulate within a home? Does hydrogen behave any differently from natural gas? And if it does blow up, is there a difference there as well? There's actually another slight difference, because if you're burning methane, which is what natural gas mainly is, then it contains carbon, and if you don't burn a gas with carbon in it completely, you get carbon monoxide produced, and that's why people have carbon monoxide detectors in their home. If you have a gas like hydrogen and you don't burn it completely, you don't produce carbon monoxide. So it's kind of safer from that point of view, which is kind of understood, but what about all these other things? So I'll give you an example of an experimental setup. This is kind of getting onto the case study now. So the question was, how does gas accumulate? How does methane, natural gas, accumulate in people's houses? How does hydrogen accumulate in people's houses? So you end up with some funding with a setup like this. This is a kind of remote farmhouse in Scotland, in the middle of nowhere, kind of a half-hour drive down a farm track, so it's definitely quite isolated. You put fences around the area so people can't go there, and then you have lots of bottles of gas like that, which you then put into the house, so you just create a leak in the house, you flood the house with gas, and then you take measurements from the gas by sampling to see, okay, how we can set the size of the leak that we've got, and then you can measure what concentrations you get to within the property. You've got to do loads of other things like make sure the electricity is disconnected from the property, because you don't want any sort of sparks and stuff like that. So that's that cabin in the background in kind of green with a portaloo next to it. That's where all the gas is kept behind there. There's then some sandbags get added in front of that, so just in case something blows up, which we're not trying to blow anything up at this stage, that it stops there, tries to keep you safe. Down this yellow gas pipe here, that's what's supplying the property, and that's where we have a leak at the property end. So we take gas from our blue cabin there, from the gas canisters that were behind it. We send it down the yellow pipe into the property, and then we suck gas from different locations in the property. Well, it would be air initially, I guess. We suck that back to the green cabin where we've got some analysis equipment. You don't really want to put the analysis equipment in the house, because then you've got electricity in the house, so you have that remotely as well. The house itself was pretty grim inside, to be honest. It was quite old and damp. But just to give you kind of an example, there's a kitchen there on the left-hand side. That's where the gas leak is. So we've kind of assumed it's maybe a gas cooker or something like that. But that is just a gas pipe with a valve that you can open, and it's just open. So hopefully you don't have one of those in your house. But that can simulate up to like someone putting an axe through a pipe or something like that, like a worst possible leak that you might get. And then you might be wondering what these kind of like little vertical things are in the different rooms. They are the places that we sampled the gas from. So they're containing tubes that you can kind of see going up, and the tubes are at 3 different points, so kind of high, mid-level, and low level. And all of those tubes go back to the cabin where you collect the data. And there's lots of sort of thought that's gone in to what you do with those tubes. So you're sucking the gas back, and then you've got some kind of pumps to draw the gas out of the property. So that inherently you've got like a sampling delay there. So you're taking the measurement in an analyzer which is sort of 100 meters away. It's going to take time for that gas to get that distance. So there's lots of tricks here, like all of the sampling lines are the same length, even if they're on the nearer side of the property, to make sure that all of those, the delay in getting the gas out of the property is the same for all of those sampling points. So far it seems like quite a simple thing to do. The only issue is you get kind of wonderful days like this in the winter, but they also make it quite difficult if you kind of get stuck at this house, which doesn't have anything in it and doesn't have any electricity, which is quite challenging. Also, we actually had power where we were taking the measurements from, but then we had power cuts there as well. And if you're relying on like little electric heaters to keep warm in a small porta cabin, it kind of introduces more challenges to collecting the data. So hopefully this gives an impression that although it seems, in essence, it seems quite simple, let's kind of leak some gas in and measure how much gas we've got, it's quite challenging in reality to do. And then in terms of the time it takes people to do, that makes it quite expensive to do. And you have to have like a handy house that you can do this in. So I'll just take us back a step just to how you might have a data pipeline when you're collecting data in an experiment like this. Often when you talk about kind of like data science, you've already got a data set that someone's provided you and it's all nice and clean already. And all you think about is maybe the data analysis that you're doing and then maybe how you visualize that, like a data viz group. But actually it's really useful to have the input of data science and data science expertise throughout the process. So from the experiment design, whereas like having those tubes are all the same length, that are sampling the gas, that reduces that equalizes the delay, the sort of sampling delay that you have. Okay, that removes one variable from the analysis. Through to data collection, data processing, data analysis, and one of the things I mentioned before, it's very important that you give non-technical specialists access to this kind of intermediate data analysis. They need to be able to see the data too. So you could put all of your data analysis in code, but that means that you have to sit with them when if they don't know how to code, when they kind of are trying to visualize and look at all these intermediate results. So having a system where they can do that themselves is quite valuable. And then indeed having a system where they can produce some of the end visualizations that need to go in the report is also useful. And I'll give a few examples in a minute, having lots of checks throughout. So not just being sort of going, oh, I found some problems in the data at the analysis stage, and that means that this house that we've now removed all the equipment from, we'd have to go back to and take more measurements. You want to try and pick up problems as soon as possible. I'm going to keep this picture on the screen in some of the next slides in like a little icon form so you can kind of see where we are in the process. So here's an actual photo from inside that little green cabin. That is actually me with a hat on looking really cold. I've got a schematic on the right-hand side of what we're actually doing, and then the photo of the equipment on the left-hand side. And to give you an idea just of sort of what systems we're using, the laptop on the left has got a little graphical interface and sort of control program written in Python, and that's collecting data which is being saved into CSV files. The actual hardware inside the kind of the box in the center is, in this one, it's an Arduino board, but it's effectively something like a Raspberry Pi, and there's some kind of relays and other things attached to it as well, which it controls. So the sample lines come in from the house on the right-hand side there, so that's all of the sets of lines coming in, because you've got some unused at this point on the right-hand side. And these little things they come through are rotameters. They measure flow rate. They've got a little sort of ball bearing in that floats depending on the gas flow. And that's an example of a manual check. So we're measuring gas flow, but we've also got a little manual indicator to check. Then we have quite a complicated system to deal with, because although we've got lots of places in the property that we want to measure gas concentration for, actually the analyzers, which are at the bottom of the screen here, we've only got 2 because they're really expensive, so we can't afford 10. So what we have to do is cycle through the different incoming lines of gas and actually take measurements of them sequentially at different times. So we kind of measure line number 1, line number 2, line number 3, and then we go back to line number 1 and repeat that process. So that all requires an element of control. That's what the Python program on the computer does, is it cycles through those and it changes relays, which are physical switches, and they control little gas valves which open and close the gas from the correct line, so we sample the correct gas. Quick talk about the next stage in the process, the data processing here. So the actual data collection was done using Python. The data processing was done using Python as well. So we use the kind of normal scientific libraries, NumPy, SciPy, and Pandas, and the visualization in Matplotlib. And the general kind of thing we did is loading the raw data from CSV produced by this program. We did some sort of processing of the data, which I'll talk about in a second, and we produced an output. So that's that's what most people think of as kind of key data science tasks. What I'm trying to hopefully say here is that actually it's the bits before and after that that we're interested in as well. Right, so those analyzers, I'm going to give you an idea of what the data looks like that we record from them. So on the y-axis here, up the side, we've got I think that's percent, I should say, the concentration that the analyzer is indicating, and we record that on the computer. So that's analyzing how much hydrogen or methane is currently in the air at that point in the property. And then you've got time on the x-axis. And it generally looks like that, which is like a really odd pattern to look at. So if you just open a CSV file in Excel or something and plot it, that's what you would see. And you suddenly remember, okay, so the reason for this is that we're rotating through different sensors. So we're reading that sensor for a little bit, sensor number 1, then we're reading sensor number 2 for a little bit, and then sensor number 3 for a little bit. But unfortunately, it's even more complicated than that, because if you have a gas and it goes into a box that measures it, and then you change the gas, you like effectively unplug the gas and plug a new gas in, the analyzer, the box, it doesn't change straight away. It takes it like a minute to even notice that you've changed the gas coming into it. So if you look at, 2 minutes there, we're taking 5-second readings. That 1.05 reading, when it changes over to sample 2, doesn't change. And it won't change for maybe a minute. So you've got to kind of think, right, okay, so there's a reaction time for the sensor there, but then also the values are changing all the time anyway because you're leaking gas into the property. So it is a little bit of a challenge to work out which of these readings do we actually believe is actually representative. So you kind of think about that for a bit and you maybe decide that, well, maybe for reading 1, sample location 1, maybe let's take the reading at 1 minute 55, and maybe we have some kind of algorithm for working out, was it sort of stabilized by that point or not? We could kind of average the last few readings, take the standard deviation, that kind of thing. So when you've done that, you kind of end up with, okay, these are our points. So we've actually got kind of point values now from this time series. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it keeps repeating. Slight awkwardness here is that number 5 was actually air. So as another check that we built in, we just measured air outside, nowhere near the property. And over time, it kind of goes to like -5% for gas concentration, and that doesn't really sound very realistic. So what's happened here is a sort of a phenomenon of a lot of scientific equipment, is that over time, as the temperatures and things inside the piece of equipment change, the actual reading you get drifts, and you generally need to kind of re-zero your equipment. It is quite difficult to do that if you've already done the experiment. So it's very lucky that we measured air in this case, because what we were then able to do is fit a linear fit through those points there and adjust all the other points by effectively adding on whatever that offset was at that time. So now it looks like that. We've got air being 0, we've corrected for drift. We can then work out what reading 1, reading 2, reading 3 were. So these are all our actual readings that we now think these are valid readings. And then you can interpolate between all of those to get an idea if that's what you think the concentration was at that time. So to summarize that kind of cycle, if you like, I'm calling it data processing as well. This is not even the analysis yet. So someone who knows about gas movement in buildings, gas dispersion and accumulation, they will probably do the analysis. This is just the kind of pre-processing. So we've identified the readings, corrected for the drift, extracted the measurements, done that interpolation step. Right, so I've moved along on that little icon now on the top right. As I said before, in these kind of projects that involve different sets of people, so multidisciplinary projects, you often have non-programmers, non-scientists involved, or maybe they're from a slightly different discipline. This is incredibly common outside academia. They need to be able to run the experiment without you there. They need to be able to run the processing pipeline. And you might help them most of the time, but they need to be able to at least do a sort of a bare minimum there. Because this is small data, not big data, often the best way of doing your analysis is just to plot lots and lots and lots of graphs constantly. I remember we had graphs printed out, like one graph on an A4 page, then we just had a big whiteboard and we stuck lots of graphs up on the page, on the board. So you were just in a room full of charts and graphs and things. And that's a really good way, and then you can kind of physically move them around and say, well, these all look similar, these look similar. So it's quite low tech. So, okay, so a piece of technology we use. So one way, we use Jupyter Notebooks in Python, and effectively this is because for the data processing, we didn't want to design a graphical interface and kind of go to all the effort to do that. What we did is we took some of the processing code and we kind of abstracted that into functions. We put those into a library file, and then we provided arguments that you could call to those functions that allowed the non-specialists to kind of, they were good enough to modify the arguments to those functions and run those functions and kind of see what output was generated. And then they didn't have to actually look at the real code. So we found that this was kind of a good compromise. So we still had to teach them a little bit about there's something called Python, that sort of thing. Some other things that we found really useful: whenever you have information about tests or about your set of data, so metadata, is try and have that in a fairly well-structured format. So in our example, we used a spreadsheet because that's what the people were most used to using. And they just had a defined set of columns, and they had to use those columns. And if you do this, then rather than having to kind of continually rename all your data files that you collect, you can just give them their existing names, and then people can attach all of the sort of various test conditions like hydrogen, natural gas, what's the leak rate. They can put it all in this file. And then if there's a problem, so for example, there's a little bit of drift that you couldn't correct for, or something like that, then you can actually have another spreadsheet where you say, right, the data between this time and this time in a particular test is invalid. And what we're trying to do is avoid the habits of most of the people I worked with of, oh, I'll just go into the data file and delete that bit of data because it's invalid, or I'll highlight it in red or something. I mean, you can't even read that with code that it's highlighted in red. So having this kind of invalid data spreadsheet is quite useful as well. Right, I'll change tack a bit just to go into a slightly different sort of follow-on project that we did. It's a bit more exciting because it involves blowing things up now. So we got a lot of confidence that, okay, we're good at measuring concentrations. Now we want to blow things up and see what happens on that. What's the consequences if it really does go wrong? And blowing up houses is quite expensive because you have to have a lot of houses that are the same, or you have to have the ability to rebuild the house afterwards. So, okay, can't quite do that. What we used instead were these shipping containers, like the one on the top left, and they're effectively what you would get on the back of a lorry or on a large container ship, but they'd been modified to kind of be like a kitchen inside. So they had some units, they had proper windows, proper plasterboard on the inside. And occasionally they had actual human dummies that the fire brigade use. And we set them up and filled them with gas, and then we had a little sort of spark generator so we could simulate, and we've got a source of ignition. they blow up, or something happens, and then we take various measurements. So we take pressure measurements from inside. We also take high-speed photography, like high-speed video, so you can get like slow-mo video of what's going on, which are really cool to look at. And then afterwards, you've got, like broken windows, broken glass. Things get thrown out the building sometimes, and you can kind of work out, there's lots of sort of sources of evidence there about how bad the explosion was. If someone was physically standing inside there when it happened, would they have been hurt? Probably the pressure data is the most important there. So we did this on a disused airfield. So this is actually one that the fire brigade used for training, so that's quite handy because there's lots of fire trucks around. But effectively, the red box there should have done it in green. That's the green box in the previous photo. That's the thing that we blow up. And then we were in a box that was about 100 meters away, which was calculated to be, hopefully, twice the distance that any debris should possibly get to. In one of the explosions, I found some debris at 70 meters away from the thing that blew up, which is a little bit worrying. But we also arranged it so that most of the debris went sideways as well. There's a view inside, quite basic in terms of a kitchen. So there's a table and chairs and a kitchen unit. We've kind of sealed it up so it's kind of like a property would be. And then we have these pressure sensors on the top, which are really high-speed pressure transducers that give you a pressure reading above ambient pressure. And you can take measurements, and we took measurements at about 10 kilohertz, so 10,000 measurements per second. They then go out of this kind of terracotta-y orangey tube, and then into a data logger inside a kind of weatherproof box that we take measurements from. And again, it's kind of the same sort of process when you actually get down to the data processing. We're using the same open source libraries that we used before. So we're loading some data. This time we've got gas concentration, like we did in the house, but we've also got this pressure data. We've got some kind of pre-processing as well, because the pressure is actually recorded as a voltage, and we need to use some calibration functions in order to get that into pressure data. We're doing some processing. I'll take you through some of the processing at the moment in a second, and then we're producing some output. Just a quick visualization of what happens during an explosion. You get hot gas, and that hot gas expands. So hot gas is produced from the oxidation reaction from the combustion, and then you have this pressure wave in the air that moves outwards, kind of roughly spherically, if there's nothing in the way. And outside that, you have the air that hasn't yet encountered that pressure wave. Here is a photo from inside that box during an explosion. So this was taken with one of the high-speed videos. So it's very difficult to see what's going on because it kind of looks white. But at the right-hand side, that's where you can kind of just see a sink. And then either side, the two things in black are like two fire service, like effectively like person dummy things. So they represent people. And we were seeing if they like moved, because they're the same kind of density as what a person would be. The idealized kind of graph, if you have a pressure sensor at a fixed point and you imagine that pressure wave coming past it, then over time you see pressure increase, get to a maximum, and that maximum is generally called the overpressure, so the pressure above whatever the atmospheric pressure is. As the pressure wave passes past the sensor, then you get a little bit of a sort of vacuum suction effect, so the pressure goes below ambient pressure and then it slowly returns to the ambient level. And the kind of things that we're interested in is how high does that go, and then the integral under that, so the area under the curve highlighted there, that both of these things kind of, if you talk to experts about it, they'll say these things convert to like damage to a person if you were standing there, or damage to a building. In reality, that's when you've cleaned up the data, it looks a bit like that, which is sort of similar to the idealized one, but you get lots of more sort of wiggles and things within it. So I think that data there was collected from that explosion there. But one of the big problems I alluded to a second ago was noise. So, okay, I put 20 kilohertz here, so probably it's either 10 or 20. For safety reasons, as you saw on the map, we're 100 meters away from this box, so we're quite far away. So all of our kind of equipment to take measurements is 100 meters away, but we're taking measurements in actually, you know, the pressure measurements have to happen locally. So there's lots and lots of long cables. But we've actually got to put some electricity into there to cause our like spark generator to come on to actually blow the thing up in the first place. So all of these kind of like long cables, the fact that we've got mains AC in there, they cause noise in the signal. So actually, the signal looks something like that on the left in blue. So that is half a second's worth of recording. And the sort of signal to noise ratio there is not very good. If you take and this is what we did, if you take a Fourier transform of that, then you can see in orange on the right-hand side, the kind of the peak on the very left is the actual signal. And then you see these artifacts of the mains noise, generally at kind of certain multiples of 50 hertz. So we've got 50 hertz, 150 hertz, and about 500 hertz there. So, okay, we bring out trusty SciPy with all of its really good library functions. And the details are kind of a little bit, I mean, this isn't really code to read. The details are involved in terms of like exactly what you pick as all of the arguments. But effectively, we wrote a function to design a notch filter to obscure part of that spectrum. And then rather than have to kind of call that every time, we put that into a notch filter function. And then to design our mains filter, we then had a loop. So there's a for loop towards the bottom there that loops through basically multiples of 50 and then applies that notch filter there to the data. And that ends up, if you plot the raw data, you get something like that. If you apply that mains filter and then also apply a median filter, which is kind of effectively a little bit of a moving average as well, then you get something like that. So it's quite a dramatic reduction in noise, and then that's the thing that you can extract your data from. So this is all, again, I would call this part of the sort of pre-processing of the data. But it's not always perfect, so we've got another example of a signal here on the left. And you can see kind of like wiggles and things in it, so I might be able to point. There's like, there's a big peak here on the left-hand side, so that's the like overpressure, that's the biggest increase in pressure. But as it comes up, there's this sort of like little wiggle here, which we think is real. But then on the right-hand side a little bit afterwards, there's this decrease here, which we think is not real. So we think that's noise. And the reason why we think that's noise is because we've got our little spark generator that kind of like every sort of half second or so produces a spark. That's what set the explosion off kind of about half a second previously at 0 on the left. But we don't know like that the explosions happen, so we just turn the spark generator on, which goes click, 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 producing lots of little sparks. And this one is roughly in line with 0.5 seconds. So we think that that's the next time the spark generator is clicking, and that's a load of noise. It produces a load of electrical noise when you produce that spark. There's another example on the right-hand side here. We seem to have got rid of the sort of the bump halfway along here, but then on the very right-hand side here, you get that kind of little dip that we've identified as noise again. So it's not always perfect, and it is useful to have some kind of manual checks as well, just like those flow meters we had with a little ball bearing inside. So there is some quite low-tech checks coming up. We spray-painted lines onto the ground at 1 meter intervals. That's what's on the left-hand side. And we put a chair at 5 meters, and we looked at whether the chair got blown over by the explosion. And then you can talk to someone who knows about it, and they will tell you whether the pressure that you saw should have blown the chair over because of the mass of the chair and that kind of thing. We also looked at, for example, bits of the building, like bits of the door, were thrown a certain distance. This was like the worst possible explosion that we had. We couldn't use that particular box again. We also look at like how far the glass is thrown and things like that, because from kind of munitions testing, like from military knowledge, there is quite a lot of knowledge about how far debris goes with certain explosions. So all of that was used as well. So once we've filtered out the noise, here's an example. The raw data without the noise without the noise removed is in light blue, and then in dark blue is that same pressure curve, but with the noise removed. We can take the maximum, we can take the minimum, we can look at the integral underneath that, so you can kind of cumulatively work out the integral just with a cumulative sum. But as I said before, a house, it's difficult to blow up a house because it's expensive. This kind of testing is still quite expensive to do because it's mainly the boxes aren't that expensive. It's the setup of all the equipment every time, and actually quite often the equipment was damaged and you needed to buy new equipment, and then you need to characterize that new equipment every time. So again, in terms of the hours it takes people to do this experiment, it's quite expensive. So we also turn to a kind of more recreatable form of explosion that's not as realistic, but it allows us to just sort of fill in the gaps. And it's effectively a sort of cannon-like tube that you've put gas inside, you have an explosion, and then you have a mass on a sort of pendulum that swings up, and then you look at how high that pendulum swings up and how quickly it moves. So to kind of give you an idea of scale, that was one of my colleagues. Then with the pendulum, you can see all the sort of tubes that measure the pressure and have the gas going in on the left-hand side. The pendulum that she's holding there swings up forwards when we're 100 meters away, just in case. And then we have a device at the top at the pivot point that allows us to measure the angle of rotation. How does that look? Well, if you've got time on the x-axis and then angle, kind of angle going upwards from 0, you can see a nice satisfying kind of like parabola-like curve there. What kind of useful information can you get from this? Well, you've got a angular speed. So from that, you can do a numerical differentiation on that. So you can just do that from one time step to the next if you want. But you get sort of slight issues in here when we're trying to look now at the rotational speed, but because you've thrown this pendulum into the air with an explosion, it actually oscillates as well. So you can kind of see there these decaying oscillations, which we're not actually, that's kind of another form of energy in the system, but if we try and average those out, we can see what the actual rotational speed is. So we apply some more like filtering noise removal like before. And then if you've got rotational speed, you've got kinetic energy. And then you've got this like weight that's actually moving up a certain amount. So you can just use mass times gravity times change in height. You can work out the increase or the change in potential energy. You can add them both together. And then extremely pleasingly, when you do it, you get an almost constant line with a slight decay on it, which implies that there's some friction in the system, which is also quite nice to see. So that's another form of, I suppose, cross-checking as well. So we wanted to know what that red line was. We wanted to know the total energy that was given to that system after the explosion, but we wanted to check, actually, does that value kind of agree with all the sort of like physical checks that we think we should be able to make. So I'll summarize with some kind of key points that I think certainly when I did these experiments, I took away from them. And I know I've kind of jumped around a bit with a few different bits of the case study, but what I'd like to pick out is that you often need, especially outside of academia, to collaborate with people who've got a completely different area of expertise. And if you might be comfortable using code to program and to do data analysis, there may be many people that are not. So what worked for us is we used Jupyter Notebooks. So that was really useful because it's a kind of visual thing. People don't have to look at the like scary terminal. But you have to find what's right for the people in your team. So it's about communicating within the team. It's not just doing that data analysis at the end of it. It's really important to know about the experiment, or if it's not, it's not necessarily your area of expertise now, it might be someone else's area of expertise. So it's really important to have as much communication with them as possible. See how data validation can be designed into the method as you go along, and actually do that as you go along as well. And then some of the bits for data processing that I picked out with when we had those spreadsheets where people could fill in, and I kind of said, you know, people like to edit data and like be, oh, I'll just delete this file because it wasn't, you know, the data's, there's a problem with the data. It's not very reproducible, that. When you come back to it kind of 2 years later and reprocess it, you might accidentally include that file or forget to re-delete the data from it or something like that. So it's always best to be able to rerun your data analysis end to end and to make sure that if you have any kind of changes like adjustments to the data that you have to apply or exclusions of any data, that's in a sort of machine readable thing that you can save when you rerun your analysis. All of those changes get reapplied to the data. Always check in every case if you can if energy is conserved, because we've found so many little problems that way. And I mean, there's lots of really good data analysis libraries, but yeah, SciPy was awesome and really useful in all of these. So I just finished by saying, so the analysis was done through Kiwa, who've allowed me to use photos and some of the sort of technical code and stuff to produce a presentation. So thank you very much for them. And if you do need to, if you want to find the slides, they're on that address. And if you want to talk to me about anything the Gene Golding Institute does, anything to do with data science, then happy to talk about it. But other than that, thank you very much.